Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a pretty significant topic. The hypothesis that governments might be intentionally hiding evidence about water fluoridation. We've gathered the sources you sent over quite a mix, scientific papers, historical context, public health discussions to really dig into this idea.
That's right. It's a potent idea, isn't it? That something so common, so widespread as water fluoridation could have dangers deliberately concealed by authorities. So our goal here is to look objectively at the arguments and the evidence presented in your materials that specifically touch on this alleged concealment.
And looking through this information, it's striking how common medical conspiracy theories seem to be generally. One study you included mentioned almost half of Americans believe in at least one. And yeah, water fluoridation being a cover-up was specifically listed. It's clearly not a fringe belief for everyone.
Absolutely. And that prevalence really highlights why we need to carefully and objectively examine this core claim you've pointed out. Are governments intentionally hiding data about fluoride's dangers?
Okay, let's dive into that central claim then, using your sources. What do they tell us about where the opposition to fluoridation even started? How does that history maybe connect to this idea of concealment?
Well, what's really interesting from the materials is that this opposition isn't new at all. The historical documents you shared trace it back quite clearly to the Red Scare, amidst all that intense anti-communist feeling. Fluoridation got framed by some groups that John Birch Society has mentioned as a form of red warfare, like a deliberate plot.
Wow. So if I'm reading the sources correctly, the initial pushback wasn't primarily about, say, scientific health data, but more tied into these broader political fears of the era.
Precisely. The sources suggest these fears may be misplaced in their target. We're tapping into a very real, deeper anxiety about government power and, individual liberty. Understanding that historical root based on your materials is pretty crucial for understanding where some of today's narratives around fluoridation come from.
Which kind of leads into the next point from your sources. How these fluoride concerns sometimes get woven into much bigger conspiracy theories, like the New World Order idea you flagged. How do the sources show that connection?
Yeah, you see that in the narratives described. For some proponents of these grander theories, water fluoridation isn't just about teeth. No, they argue it's part of some vast government scheme run by, shadowy groups aimed at controlling or even harming people. Sometimes mind control gets mentioned, or weakening the population somehow.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to the specific arguments against fluoridation that pop up in the materials. What are the main ethical and scientific points people raise that fuel this opposition? And what do the sources offer as counterarguments?
That's a really important distinction in the sources, the different types of arguments. Ethically, some raise serious points. They reference things like the Nuremberg Code, arguing fluoridation is basically mass medication without getting everyone's consent, that it violates individual rights. You also see the precautionary principle mention the idea that if there's potential harm, even unproven, we should err on the side of caution. Oh, and concerns about financial conflicts of interest, like the chemical industry benefiting, that comes up too.
And what's the other side of that coin? According to the public health folks and experts cited in your sources, how do they respond to those points?
Well, the Nevada Department of Public Behavioral Health perspective, as laid out in your materials, is pretty clear. They argue public health decisions have to look at the whole community's well-being based on the best available science, not just the perhaps extreme fears of a small group. They draw analogies, right, like vaccination or fortifying foods, other things done for public health. The thinking there, according to the sources, is that the collective benefit, if supported by strong science, can justify these kinds of measures, even with some individual objections.
Okay, let's get into the science itself, because that's a huge part of the material you shared. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s claims about neurotoxicity, links to lower IQ, they're prominent. Your sources tackle this head-on, especially with that EPA trial context. What's the gist?
Right, the science is really where a lot of the current debate seems focused, judging by your sources. Kennedy's claims, as reported, often cite studies suggesting a link between high fluoride exposure and reduced IQ. And often these are studies from areas where fluoride levels in water are naturally very high, much higher than typical fluoridation levels. The lawsuit against the EPA you mentioned, its core argument, as described, is that fluoride poses an unreasonable risk of injury to health.
But the level of exposure seems absolutely critical here. What do the scientific experts in your sources say about the evidence at the levels used in community water fluoridation programs?
That's the key distinction, exactly. Many experts cited in your sources view the evidence linking low-level fluoride exposure, the kind you get from typical fluoridated water, to neurotoxicity as, well, weak or inconclusive. Dental fluorosis, like mottling of teeth, is a known effect from too much fluoride in early childhood, but it's usually mild at recommended levels. The CDC's position, referenced in your materials, is that there's no established link between recommended water fluoridation and other major negative health outcomes. They also point out the EPA has set safety limits, and the level recommended for dental health, around 0.7 milligliter, is well below the upper limit considered safe, 4 milligliter.
Your source collection also digs into the National Toxicology Program report and several meta-analyses. This feels like really important ground to cover for understanding the scientific debate. Can you walk us through what these reports found and any controversies mentioned?
Yes, definitely crucial context. One source clarifies that Mr. Kennedy was quoting an older draft of an NTP meta-analysis. The updated NTP findings from August 2024, as detailed in your materials, state moderate confidence that higher fluoride exposures specifically above the WHO guideline of 1.5 milligl are consistently associated with lower IQ. But importantly, the NTP itself says more research is needed on the effects of lower exposure levels. And as your sources note, some experts have criticized the NTP report, feeling it might overstate the certainty of effects at those lower levels.
Okay, and what about the other meta-analyses you included? They seem to have slightly different conclusions, is that right?
They do offer some nuances, yeah. A 2021 study in Scientific Reports, which was in your collection, did find a link between high fluoride and lower IQ, but explicitly no link at low levels, around 0.5 to 1 milligliter, though they also noted the overall evidence quality was low. Then there's a 2023 meta-analysis in environmental research you provided. It suggested a possible link even down near 1 milligliter, but it stressed that the study showing the biggest negative effects had a high risk of bias. And the one study in that analysis considered low bias actually found no negative effect. Finally, another 2023 study in public health, also in your materials, specifically looked at levels at or below 1.5 milligliter and found no relationship between fluoride and IQ at typical community fluoridation levels.
There was also mention in the sources of Christine Till's research, which seems to have sparked quite a bit of debate. What's the story there, based on what you shared?
Right. Christine Till's work, linking prenatal fluoride exposure to lower IQ in kids, as presented in your sources, definitely caused a stir. There were criticisms about methodology, and at one point, accusations about data access, or lack thereof. Till and her team defended their findings, arguing for the biological plausibility, including potential sex-specific effects. But the whole episode, the back and forth described, really highlights how contentious this research area is. Eventually, data access policies were clarified.
So given that the scientific case for harm at recommended levels isn't exactly a slam dunk, what other reasons might explain why people still believe in this idea of intentional concealment, according to your sources?
The materials suggest a few possibilities beyond just the scientific debate itself. A general distrust of government, or maybe large institutions in general, seems plausible as a factor. One article you included also touches on the psychology, how conspiracy theories can provide a sense of certainty or explanation when dealing with complex, sometimes uncertain science. It gives a simple answer? Maybe.
And the role of misinformation seems pretty central in the narrative presented in your sources. How have things like pseudoscience or cherry-picked data fueled the anti-fluoridation movement?
Yeah, that comes through strongly in some of the sources. Materials from the Science History Institute and that story behind the science piece really detail this. They talk about how misinformation, sometimes work that completely bypasses peer review, has historically been used to stir up anti-fluoridation feelings. The example of John Yamuyanis using selectively chosen data and incomplete citations, as described in your sources, is a case study in that. And apparently, outdated studies just keep getting circulated in anti-fluoridation circles, keeping old fears alive.
Okay. Pulling all this together then, based strictly on the information within the sources you provided, is there any actual concrete evidence presented that points to an intentional government conspiracy to hide dangers about fluoride at recommended levels?
Based purely on the material you've shared, the short answer seems to be no. What the sources do show is a lot of debate about how to interpret existing scientific studies, especially those looking at higher fluoride levels. And there are clearly differing opinions on how significant that research is and whether it applies to public health policy at the much lower recommended levels. But actual verifiable evidence within these specific sources indicating a deliberate government plot to hide data about dangers at recommended levels. We didn't find that presented.
And just briefly, it's probably worth mentioning the other side, the established benefits of fluoridation, as a kind of counterpoint to the conspiracy narrative that emerges from your sources. What do they say on that?
Right, that's an important piece of context from the sources. Organizations like the CDC and the Nevada DPBH info you had consistently highlight the benefits significantly reduce tooth decay. That New York study mentioned showed Medicaid patients in non-fluoridated areas needed more dental work. And poor dental health isn't trivial, right? The sources link it to missed school days, maybe even affecting job prospects later on. It's also quite telling, perhaps, that in that EPA lawsuit we discussed, the court isn't allowing discussion of fluoridation's benefits, only the potential risks.
So if we try to synthesize all these different threads from your sources, what's the overall picture regarding this hypothesis of intentional government concealment around water fluoridation?
Well, again, our goal was just to objectively assess the claims based on the materials you gave us. We've seen the historical roots, how opposition tied into Cold War anxieties, as outlined in your sources. We've looked at the ongoing scientific discussion, especially the focus on high exposure levels versus recommended levels. And we've seen how misinformation and just different ways of reading the science play a really big role in shaping perceptions, according to these documents.
And the bottom line assessment based purely on these sources provided.
The bottom line seems to be this. While your sources definitely show there are ongoing scientific questions and genuine concerns, particularly about high fluoride exposure, they don't provide conclusive evidence of an intentional government conspiracy to hide dangers specifically related to the recommended levels used in community water fluoridation. The controversy looks more like a complex mix: genuine scientific debate, leftover historical distrust, and the unfortunate impact of persistent misinformation, all reflected in the materials you shared.
Thanks for taking that deep dive with us into these sources.
Absolutely. It's certainly a complex issue with many layers, as your provided information demonstrates.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.